Welcome back to another episode of the Leading and Learning with AI podcast. I'm your host for today, Brittany Blackwell, former educator of 13 years and marketing lead here at Panorama Education. I am so excited to be chatting with the textbook ditcher himself, Matt Miller. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Thank you so much. I don't know if I've gotten that specific intro before, the textbook ditcher. I'll take it though.
Yeah. Well, for those listeners who may not be familiar with your work, could you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you teach, like what makes you this leader in the AI and education space?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Matt Miller. I taught high school Spanish for more than 10 years here in little bitty schools in West Central Indiana. Since then, I've written 6 books, including a book called AI for Educators. And in a lot of ways, I'm just doing what all the rest of us are doing, which is I'm trying to learn about AI and figure out what it is, but mostly how is it being applied in schools and the impacts and the effects and the implications on learning all the way down to the teeny tiniest of assignment, all the way up to the biggest implications on education. And so, since then, I've gotten to speak at schools and school districts all over the United States, at different events as a keynote speaker and a workshop presenter and everything. But I'm also teaching in the classroom, so I'm practicing it in my own class. I'm a high school Spanish teacher right now, and I'm teaching part-time, face-to-face. In fact, I just gave my final exam yesterday. So as of the recording of this right now, I'm officially on winter break. So that's kind of me in a nutshell right there.
I mean, I love the original book was Ditch That Textbook. And
Right.
you were very big into that. And I think that follows along with like AI and all of those things. And Matt, teachers know that AI has really changed the game. From what you're seeing in classrooms and what you're experiencing in the classroom, what are teachers still trying to figure out right now when it comes to AI?
Everything. Everything, right? I mean, because it can have implications in so many different places, I think the first thing, especially if you talk to middle school and high school teachers, the first thing they're thinking about is students are using AI to do all of their work for them. And they want to keep thinking going, they want to keep skill development going, they want students discussing and, really growing, I guess. They want all of that stuff to still go on. And I think that it certainly can with AI in the room, but there's this hurdle to go over where we have all of these assignments that teachers have assigned for decades, maybe centuries at this point, asking students to show us what they've learned and show us how they're thinking by putting it on paper. And of course, these days, paper sometimes means a digital document. And if you put text on a digital document, then by golly, AI is really good at that. Mm-hmm. And so we're trying to sort of square the circle now of like, how do we understand that learning has happened? How do we understand, how do we help students to make their thinking visible, to show that learning has happened? All we're really doing is we're just trying to, give them a bit of accountability that they are growing and developing as human beings. But when in schools, we've gotten so fixated on the end product, give me the answers to this math problem, give me the ABCDs to this multiple choice question, this essay, this research report or whatever. And AI is really good at creating end products. But our traditional education system has gotten to the point where the end product is the checkbox that we have to fill to show that learning has happened, even though as teachers, and our students know this too, but as teachers, we know the good stuff isn't tied directly to the end product. A lot of times it's in the process and the wrestling of getting there. So I think that's one of the big things that teachers are really trying to figure out, whether they have words for it in this way or not, is that the way that we've shown learning in the past is kind of being poisoned by AI. And so now we're going to have to come up with a different way to be able to do it. And what does that different way look? That's the hard thing right now. That's the thing that everybody's trying to wrestle with, is how do we reshape and reform how we've done education for decades or maybe centuries in light of this brand new technology that so many of us are trying to wrestle with. Big deal, just like little stuff. Like, how do we totally reshape how we do education?
Exactly, exactly. And I think you hit the nail on the head when we are talking about the fears that teachers have around AI. And the biggest thing that's on their mind is, yeah, these end products can be easily replicated by AI, especially when it comes to like writing tasks. And I think that's why it's so important for us to be in the middle of the whole process, the writing process. What other types of assignments have you seen teachers struggle with now that AI is so heavily embedded?
Yeah, I think writing is definitely one of the big ones, but I mean, really, it's anything where you want students to do independent thinking. Another big one that I think is you know, a real issue right now is just homework at large.
Mhm.
Homework in general. You know, I've had issues with homework for a long time. As a high school Spanish teacher, I quit giving homework years ago just because I didn't feel like it was producing the results. You know, the amount of time and effort and an argument that sometimes you have with students just was not justifying itself in results. And so I kind of gave up on it. But today, you know, in the AI age, so to speak, to send students home and ask them to do things that they don't see as relevant or they don't see as important or they don't see the connection and they're just doing it because the teacher tells them to do it.
Mhm.
Of course, they're going to outsource things to AI. It really does sort of speak to a bigger issue that's happening. And actually, it's happening with us as adults too. We're looking at the work that we need to do, the things that we need to do, and we're asking, does this deserve my attention?
Mm.
And, you know, as adults, we call that efficiency. We call that productivity. And we think of it as a good thing because it means that we can take our attention because we know our attention is finite, right? We don't have an infinite amount of attention. We only have a certain number of minutes and a certain amount of attention. And so we're basically, you know, using AI, using technology, using whatever it is that we can to help us to use that attention and focus those minutes on the things that matter most. Well, here's the problem. Students are doing it too. And
Mhm.
sometimes their judgment is not the way that we would like to see it. And so we're stuck in this spot where if we send it home and they don't see the relevance or the importance, or if they just run out of time, or if they just don't really care about the grade that much or whatever it is, they're going to find a way to get done with it faster so they can allocate that attention to something else. See, it's sort of like this big human condition. We just don't like sometimes the way that students are applying it. And so I think that's really a big call for all of us as educators to make sure this doesn't solve all of it, but to make sure that what we're asking students to do is relevant, that it's important, that they understand why we're doing it, that they understand how they're going to grow and benefit as a result. I think for the longest time, as educators, we've always just assumed that they could figure that out. But these days, I think it's going to be even more incumbent upon us to make it very clear why we're doing what we're doing.
Absolutely. I think you were kind of touching on this too, but engagement looks a lot different now than it did because tasks that we want students to do no longer demand the thinking sometimes. What does engagement look like when the task no longer demands thinking?
You know, engagement was a tricky thing to define even before AI. You know, some people see it as our students having fun. Some people see it as our students on task. Some people see it as are they, you know, do they have a why? Do they have a reason for doing it? Some of them see it as students being in sort of a flow state where they're totally connected to the work and they're, you know, they're really sort of like vibing with the work and everything. So, you know, engagement was hard to define before. And now that you have AI, it's like, you know, it gets even trickier. So I think you're right. We have to kind of dial in on what it is that we want students to do and what's our goal, what's our outcome out of all of this. But I really do think some of it does come back to attention, comes back to, well, I would say attention, if we're trying to define engagement, which is what you asked me, right? In terms of this sort of like new AI world, I think attention has something to do with it, but also like our intended purpose. Like, what are we trying to get out of this? And also, what are our goals? What are our students striving towards? What are we trying to accomplish as a class and everything? You know, for a long time, we've had to have answers to that on the class level. and on the school level. But nowadays, AI does give us the opportunity to personalize things down a little bit more. You connect students with like with an AI chatbot or some sort of AI model or something, and it can help kind of personalize those things. So, yeah, when it comes to engagement, you're right. It's all sort of changing a little bit, but I think we've really got to be focused on where are we headed and what are students willing to spend those attention minutes on.
Yeah. And, we are talking a lot about like how teachers are thinking about AI as being used as the shortcut instead of like a thinking tool. How can teachers instead kind of raise the level in student thinking? And where have you seen like teachers use AI in that way?
Yeah. So I think there's sort of a misconception out there that AI is going to make students stupid and it's going to shortcut their thinking and it's going to cause them not to think. And you know what? There are lots of ways where it can be used that way, but there are also lots of ways where it isn't used that way.
Mhm.
Now, here's another misconception. Another misconception, especially for the AI cheerleaders, is that if we use AI to do all of these things all the time, then it will lead to all of this deep thinking. And I don't think that's the case at all either. There are all of these calls out here. It just feels like on social media recently, I've seen a lot of stuff about ban the laptops, ban the technology, screens are terrible. We got to get back to paper and pencil. We got to get back to, and you know what? There's some benefit in that too, I think. But I think if we want to come to the right answer on all of this, it all comes back down to the teacher and the instructional. You want to accomplish strategy or is going to accomplish it the most. And for me, it's something that I'm seeing in my own Spanish classes. We still do an awful lot of whole group instruction. I like to talk to my students in Spanish. I like to, tell stories and, just be sort of silly and ask them questions and stuff so that they hear lots of spoken Spanish. That is non-AI, non-technology time. But you know what? If I'm going to have a sub in the room, if I'm going to leave class, a sub plan where there's an AI them instant feedback. Because if I just leave them a packet of worksheets, if I decide, oh, somebody said that technology and screens are terrible, so I better not use them. If we just keep doing all of this all or nothing thinking, then I'm going to leave them that packet of worksheets and they're not going to get any sort of instant feedback. So I think that's where as teachers, we've got to just use our teacher brains and just decide, is this best or is this best? And which one am I going to use for this particular? We get granular about it, right? We get down to the little specific activities instead of just saying technology is the savior or technology is terrible.
Yeah. I really like how you're explaining not only what are the fears, but also where people are being a little bit too like gung ho about AI. Where are teachers making really big mistakes when they're experimenting with AI?
Ah, that's a good question. I think in general, experimenting, I might take your question in a couple different directions if I could.
Yeah.
I think experimenting with AI, I don't think there are necessarily lots of mistakes. There are some of those, like baseline, like keep yourself safe, understand not to put personally identifying information into a chatbot and understand what it's using the data for. There's all of that sort of like baseline AI literacy stuff that you have to be careful with. If you're experimenting on your own to figure out the technology and figure out how it works, I figure, push all the buttons and pull all the levers and figure out how the technology works so that you can figure out if it's good for you or not, One mistake that I would see teachers making if they're going to start to use it with students is to take the human out of the loop. You hear more and more people talking about, this is sort of like one of those, like computer programming, like developer ideas of having a human in the loop, which means, we don't just let AI run with everything on its own. We want to make sure that there are human eyes on it and that there's a human brain processing in the background. So if something weird happens or if the results are unintended or whatever, then we can, sort of intervene. That goes for when students are interacting with it live, having For instance, we've got so many of these platforms where you can keep an eye on how students are working synchronously, like live in the moment. You can see those transcripts. You can identify what students are doing. It's good to do that to make sure that if something is going completely wrong, you can shut it down. Or if you need to go talk to an individual student about how they're using it or about a particular response from AI, you can do that. So I think when it comes to live, I think that's important. But also for teachers, I think another place where having a human in the loop is important is when you test it out ahead of time. For me, whenever I'm making these assignments, I'm going to preview it and I'm going to see how it looks. And then if it doesn't perform the way that I want, I'm going to go in and adjust the instructions that I've given the AI, and then I'm going to test it again. I'm going to test it again. And we know that AI isn't, it doesn't perform the same every single time. So there is a level of uncertainty, but the more that you hone those instructions in and you test them out, you do your due diligence as a teacher ahead of time. Once you do some of that, you have a pretty good idea of how it's going to act with your students, and you don't let it loose to interact with your students until you feel pretty good about what you've got. So I'd say, to answer your question, as far as where are some missteps? I think that's probably one of them is, just turning AI loose a little too quickly when we don't have that human in the loop.
Yes, I love that saying, the human in the loop, because I think that's, one of the biggest fears among teachers are that they will become non-existent or we won't be needed, but the human is always needed in that loop. We talked a little bit about this earlier, but how is this new AI use really forcing teachers to rethink what counts as meaningful work?
Yeah, that's a good question. What counts as meaningful work? Because it's not meaningful if a student doesn't put any human thought into it whatsoever and lets AI do it. But also, on the other end of that spectrum, it might be meaningful work if they interact with a chatbot and they pursue a line of thinking that they might not have considered. But a traditional teacher might look at that and say, oh, all they're doing is just chatting with that chatbot. That doesn't count. I think on both sides, I think you bring up a really good point. On both sides, we have to rethink what's okay and what's not. Because if we continue to send homework assignments home, we're asking students to do, like essays and research reports that they're not really doing, that they're just cognitively offloading to AI. That's not okay, and it's time to start to rethink. But then on the other side, we might come up with new tasks and go, oh, wow, I was interacting with that chatbot, and man, in my experience, I was learning a lot about it, and that would be really helpful for students. I need to consider that as a new thing. And then I would even say in the middle of that spectrum, if I painted that spectrum well enough to make it make sense, that, there are things that we're asking students to do that are not meaningful. And then there's things that we've never really done before that actually are meaningful. In the middle, we've got some of those practices that we've done before that we're going to have to adapt. And I see this, let me give you an example. In English classes, humanities classes, and social studies, government, stuff like that, where students are having to write. And if you send them home with it, and if you also aren't very hands-on with it, then they're going to probably see it as this great big task, and they're not sure how to do the steps, or they're unsure of themselves. And that self-efficacy can lead students to want to offload things to AI. But if you sit with students, even in a whole group setting, and you go, okay, we're going to do this piece by piece, bit by bit, all together. That's an adaptation that I'm seeing some folks do. Now, that does mean that we're going to get students more likely to do the work themselves if they're doing it there in person. But of course, the drawback to that is it's time consuming. It takes a long time. Maybe something that was done in 4 days gets done in 6 or 7 or 8 days. Oh, I said 6 or 7. Somebody's going to scold me for that. But in 6 or 7 or 8 days or something, it takes us that long to do. And we're going, my goodness, this didn't used to take this long before. But I think, I would love to have a magical answer that makes that make sense. But I think the reality is that, we have to look at our students and go, maybe their skills to be able to pull something like this off are not as good as they used to be, and they're going to need a little bit of extra handholding. We might not like it. It might not be where we want them to be, but maybe it's where they actually are. And if our whole goal, I know for me with my students, my whole goal is to take them from where they are and just move them up. It's not to assume that they're all the way up here and just start teaching up there. I want to figure out where they actually are, and I want them to develop. And, maybe that's what we've got to do. I don't totally remember what your question was, but I hope we answered it.
No, you did answer it. And I really think like this whole process of the way that we're kind of changing up assessment and what's important, all of those things. I think what we're starting to really go back to, and I think teachers for a long time have felt this way, but never had a way to do it right or show the importance, is that the process is more important than the product. And I think that that's very freeing for a lot of teachers, but it can be really uncomfortable too. It's kind of how you explained it in the spectrum that you kind of explained there.
Yeah, you're right. And that's something that I'm hearing more and more and more people talk about, is the importance of the process. The way I always like to say it in like my presentations and stuff is I'll say, when AI cheapens the product, then we focus on the process. And I feel like that's kind of where we are now. One thing I think we have to be super careful of is that folks in positions like me, or in positions like you, or if you're in a, professional development training position or a leadership position or something, it's easy to throw little catchphrases and buzzwords around like process over product, and then tell teachers, okay, that's what you need to do. And the teachers will roll their eyes at you and be like, yeah, but how does that actually show up in a real class? So I think if we're going to talk that talk, I think we've got to be able to walk that walk and talk about how it shows up. And so, for instance, if we have an end product, whether it's a project or a research paper or whatever it is, I think one very practical way to look at it is, how are you allocating points in the gradebook? Because we know for lots of students, points in the gradebook are like a currency. They're like your bank account. And how you're gonna allocate those points are gonna have a lot to do with how I proceed with your assignment. And so if we look at that assignment and we go, end product is where all of those points are, what message is that communicating? It's communicating that the end product is the most important thing, and how I get there is not as important. And I'd say in today's day and age, we're going to have to almost flip that on its head. I've talked to some teachers who have said, I've started almost allocating more points to the benchmarks along the process instead of the end product, because that's the stuff that matters, and that's where I see the real learning happening. Those are some of the little things I think when we talk about process versus product. I think we're going to have to ask those very practical, concrete questions of, how does this really actually show up in a classroom?
Mm-hmm. Can you think of any, like off the top of your head right now, where you've seen or that you've done where that process has been more important than the product, that you can give like a clear, really good example of?
Oh gosh, in my class, that's really all that it is. I was just telling my wife the other day, I'm a high school Spanish teacher, right? I feel like after all of these years, I feel like learning Spanish is kind of like shooting free throws. I'm from Indiana. Basketball is king here, so I've got to do a basketball analogy. And how do you get better at shooting free throws? You just shoot lots of them, and you miss a lot of them. Even the people who are really good at shooting free throws are still going to miss, 10% of them, 15% of them, 20% of them, depending on the level that you're on, So you end up missing them, but your muscles and your muscle memory and your ability to replicate that process gets better with practice. And so for me, that's why I put so much emphasis in that. I was telling you that whole class instruction where my students are listening to me speak in Spanish, because we also know that in world languages that your ability to hear and comprehend is much better than your ability to create output, to be able to write or to be able to speak. So I'm giving them lots and lots and lots of input, and that's the process. And sometimes my students will look at me and be like, Mr. Miller, we've done like 2 or 3 of these goofy stories in class where you're just making stuff up and telling these stories, and they're not all that funny either. It's hard to be creative on a regular basis, I gotta tell
Right.
you. But they're like, all we're doing is these these practice stories over and over and over again. And I'm like, yeah, but are they easier to understand every time? And whether they like identify it or not, the answer is going to be yes.
Mhm.
That's the process. And
Mhm.
so if I went to the end product and I said, I want you to go write one of these stories, and we hadn't done all of that repetition, that's jumping to the end product. And if they look at that and they go, I don't know if I can do that. I doubt my ability to do that. I don't have enough time to do that. I don't understand the steps to do that. What are they going to do? They're going to turn to Google Translate. And that's
Mhm.
not what I want. So
Right.
I mean, that's just the first example. Of course, it comes right out of my own classroom, but that's the first example I can think of as far as, the process being really important.
Yeah. If there's a teacher listening and thinking, I know AI is here, but I'm really just not sure how to respond without lowering my expectations, what would you want them to hear?
Oh my goodness. I think we've got to continually go back to that idea of what are my goals and what do I want students to accomplish and how can we get them there?
Mhm.
That almost sounds too simple and it sounds a little bit like a cop out, but I think that we've got to go back to those foundational things. So we look at those assignments that feel like, because you said without lowering my expectations. That's
Mhm.
such a loaded statement that we can go in so many different directions on, right?
Right.
Because some of it is if my expectations are here, but my student skills are much lower, what are we going to do? I can keep my expectations up here, but if my students aren't there, and we could play the blame game all day. We can make it a COVID thing. We can make it a social media thing. We can make it an AI thing. We can make it whatever it is. The parents or the culture. I don't know. At some point, the blame game doesn't really matter. The reality is that my students are here and my expectations are here, and somebody's going to have to move. And I cannot wave a magic wand and boom, make my students' skills get higher
Mhm.
because that's the point of school, right? So at some point, I think we're gonna have to come to terms with where they really are. Um, so maybe that does mean lowering your expectations a little bit. Sorry, I know that wasn't really the answer to the question, but I think we've got to meet students where they are. Or if we want to keep our expectations high, we've got to scaffold the heck out of it. We've got to come up with supports that help our students. I keep using my hands, that like if my expectations are up on the 7th floor of the building and my students are only on the 2nd floor, you know what scaffolding looks like if you're going to like paint a house or build a house or something? We're going to have to build a whole bunch of that scaffolding up there to get them up there.
Mhm.
Something's going to have to happen. And that's really sort of like the heart of teaching, I think, is supporting kids to be able to make those leaps, to be able to understand things, to be able to grow to the point where they can get up there. And it's slow and it's tedious and it's not linear either because we think that if we do the work over time, we're going to see consistent growth. You don't always.
Right.
And so I think if we can sort of get real with our reality and understand that maybe we have further to go than we think, and we're going to have to provide kids with all of the supports that we can to help them to get there. I think that's my best answer. Like I said, I wish I could just wave a magic wand and, come up with a way for us to be able to get up to those high standards. But that's sort of the challenge of education. That's the challenge of teaching real human children in a classroom, I think.
Yeah, and I think this moment really creates a lot of possibility, and it's you said it earlier, but it's really not about giving up the rigor. It's not about any of those things. It's meeting your students where they are and really being able to progress from there. Last but not least, I want to ask one more question. We're asking leaders in this space, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this. In the next 1 to 3 years, when it comes to AI in education, what are you most excited about?
What am I most excited about? I could probably go any number of different directions on this. I'll give you my one most excited for today, knowing that if you ask me again tomorrow, it might be something different. I think the one thing that I'm most excited about, and some of the like big influencers and thought leaders in our space and everything would say, "Oh, you're thinking too small on this."
Mhm.
Um, I would tell them that's evidence that you haven't been in a classroom recently. Here's my thing. I'm excited about giving teachers some support so they can get through the work and get home at night and improve their mental health and not feel like they're burned out all the time. Because if you look back over the last 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, probably farther back than that, we lose really good teachers because teaching is hard and because schools pile lots of things on teachers' plates and they don't give them the supports to be able to get through all of it. And if we can leverage AI to get through some of the tedious, monotonous stuff faster so that we can focus teachers on the things that they were made to do as teachers, that's going to be good for teachers. It's going to be good for kids. It's going to be good for schools. It's going to be good for this world because kids will get the education that they need to go out into the world. So, I might have different things about personalizing education and meeting kids and, all of that stuff. Today, it's just, I want to equip teachers so that they can get through the stuff that they need to, so that they will keep being teachers because we still need really good teachers.
Absolutely. I mean, teachers will always be needed and AI will never take over that part. So I'm glad we're just reinforcing. And for any teacher who's out there who's like, you just kind of let me breathe a little bit. Thank you for that. Today, we surfaced a lot of shifts that are happening in classrooms right now. But your session at Panoramic is going to walk teachers through strategies that make those shifts work for real students. Can you talk just a little bit about what your session is about and what teachers can expect by attending Panoramic?
Yes, absolutely. So we're going to touch on some of these realities in the classroom and, how do we keep, critical thinking and problem solving and all of those very important human skills. How do we keep those at the forefront and how do we help students to develop those? And spoiler alert, sometimes it doesn't have anything to do with AI. Sometimes it involves putting the technology away and having conversations and having students do work offline, but also learning about how all of it works so that we can grow the humans, so that we can grow those very human skills to prepare students for whatever comes their way. So we're going to be touching on a lot of that stuff as it applies to the classroom and the school.
I'm really excited for that, Matt, and I'm excited for more educators and leaders to hear this episode. So thank you again for just, popping in and sharing more about your thought process with AI and just helping to soothe teachers' minds when it comes to the fears that they have around AI, but also what you're looking forward to as well.
Absolutely. Love the conversation. Thanks, Brittany.
Yeah. If any part of this episode made you think differently, you will want to be at Panoramic on February 26th. The link to show up and sign up for free is in the show notes below. Thanks again for tuning in. And as always, keep leading, keep learning, and keep building what's next.